You ready?
You're ready.
Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. I now recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Today's hearing comes nearly 1 year after this subcommittee held a joint field hearing in McAllen, Texas with the Subcommittee on Health. It presents a chance to reevaluate the conditions at our southern border, and the conditions have only further deteriorated since that time. The implications of the border crisis extend far beyond the border communities, impacting every aspect of our nation. This crisis is not a political talking point. It's a real, widespread crisis with extensive repercussions. In McAllen, Texas, I highlighted the unprecedented way this administration operates our borders. We have reached all-time highs with the number of migrants crossing the southern border. I further expressed concerns over President Biden's handling of the border, describing it as brutal and unsustainable. Since then, the Customs and Border Protection, CBP, have reported for fiscal year 23 an astounding 2.47 million encounters at the southwest border. This is a significant escalation from approximately 450,000 encounters in fiscal year 2020. In December 2023 alone, there was an estimated 302,000 migrant encounters at the southern border, the highest monthly total ever recorded. This flood of migrants was seen during a visit by congressional members to the southern border. During this visit, some members visited a hospital in Eagle Pass, Texas, along the border that is currently providing care for illegal immigrants. According to one of my colleagues, this hospital has a total of 5 ambulances, and one is permanently dedicated to solely transporting illegal immigrants. That doesn't mean that the others aren't used for that purpose, but one is dedicated solely to that purpose. Once in the hospital, these illegal migrants are prioritized over American citizens due to acuity concerns. In the end, this is unfair to citizens of this country and is directly due to the failure of the Biden administration to secure our southern border. Sadly, this administration seems to prioritize the health and interests of illegal migrants over those of its own citizens. Even mayors of cities like New York and Chicago are now confronting the implications and costs associated with the influx of illegal migrants that border communities have long had to deal with. These large cities are struggling to find resources to address the problem. New York has even started to force their children to sign up for online classes so they can house the illegal migrants in the schools. Additionally, the absence of effective border control has led to a significant influx of drugs, especially fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, into our communities. A loophole cartels used prior to temporary listing of analogs to traffic fentanyl into our country was by creating fentanyl analogs to evade our criminal laws. Right now, fentanyl analogs are considered Schedule I substances, but only because of temporary scheduling orders which expire on December 31st, 2024. Representative Ladd and my bill, the Halt Fentanyl Act, passed the House with bipartisan support in May of 2023. It would permanently schedule fentanyl analogs while allowing research into them to see if there's any efficacy. Beyond fentanyl, the administration's border policies have facilitated the abuse and exploitation of migrants, particularly children. The New York Times has uncovered a rise in child labor trafficking. Children as young as 13 are being forced into dangerous jobs, often in violation of federal labor laws. This is done by the sponsors our government has placed these children with. We've seen reports of severe injuries, and in some cases, even fatalities. The Times reported that over 85,000 children entrusted to HHS's care have seemingly vanished, lost in a system that fails to protect the most vulnerable. This is due to the complete and utter failure of HHS to implement proper vetting processes that include detailed background checks consisting of FBI background checks and fingerprinting. In September of 2023, HHS proposed a rule regarding unaccompanied minors. This rule does little to bolster the vetting process used to place these minors. This rule makes the vetting process optional to examine living conditions, conduct background checks, and interview the sponsors before a minor is placed with them. Optional. Optional. Further, this rule does nothing to address the collaboration between state and local law enforcement, local schools, or state and local child welfare services when a child is placed with a sponsor. In short, open borders not only endanger American lives, but perpetuate criminal enterprises that exploit these vulnerable individuals. The Biden administration wants to ignore the crisis being caused by its border policies. We had a hearing in July with Secretary of HHS discussing the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The committee sent additional questions for the record to the Secretary, and he still hasn't responded to our questions. It is yet another example of how this administration tries to ignore this crisis. The situation at our southern border is simply unsustainable. It is affecting public safety, public health, and public education. This should not be a Republican versus Democrat issue. This is an American issue. I yield back. The chair now recognizes Subcommittee Ranking Member Ms. Castor for her 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America is not alone in grappling with the challenges of immigration. People fleeing violence and oppression, fleeing overseas wars, or the impacts of the climate crisis. These drivers are forcing millions of people to search for greater safety and stability for their families. Here in the U.S. Congress, we have a responsibility to update our laws, but have failed to do so for 30 years. We're spending billions of dollars at the border, but unless we can come together with bipartisan solutions, we will continue to grapple with these challenges. Do you know, on his first day in office, President Biden proposed a comprehensive immigration reform package, and the administration has repeatedly asked for more resources to secure the border. However, House Republicans have refused to fund border security at needed levels. In August of 2023, the Biden administration requested an additional $4 billion for the border and migration issues, including $800 million to reduce the influx of fentanyl across the southern border. House Republicans took a pass on that request. In October 2023, the Biden administration requested $13.6 billion for border enforcement and migration management, which included funding to hire 1,000 CBP officers for fentanyl-related investigations and equipping southern border ports of entry with detection technologies. But House Republicans have repeatedly failed to respond to that request. Meanwhile, across America, I think there is a lot of bipartisan agreement on creating tough but fair pathways to citizenship, which will discourage migrant families from making the dangerous journey through the Darien Gap. There's bipartisan agreement out there in the world on the need to better target human traffickers who lure innocent migrants with misinformation and false hope. This past weekend, Mexican authorities recovered the bodies of a woman and 2 children who drowned in the Rio Grande while trying to enter the United States. Federal agents learned that there were migrants in distress and asked Texas officials for access to provide aid, but they were refused. These tragic and inhumane deaths are not isolated incidents, as the International Organization for Migration documented 686 deaths and disappearances across the U.S.-Mexico border in 2022. Reforming our outdated immigration system would decrease the number of desperate people coming to the southern border and bolster our national security by allowing Border Patrol agents to focus on true threats. One of the Biden administration's initiatives that is working, that I have seen back home in Florida, is the new parole initiative that allows migrants from Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti to apply outside of the United States per strict requirements to come to our country, with vetting, with a sponsor that is responsible, financially responsible. This is an example of using the limited tools the administration has at its disposal to humanely and justly address the crisis. But codifying these kind of pathways to citizenship, pathways to work, don't seem to interest my GOP colleagues. They've refused to give the administration the resources it needs. They've held funding of the federal government hostage and demanded support for their cruel and costly immigration package at the cost of getting real work done. Now, this subcommittee held a hearing with Secretary Becerra after reports emerged about widespread exploitation of undocumented children in factories across the United States. But instead of addressing these appalling episodes of child exploitation, Republicans are pushing budgets that would slash resources for the very offices tasked with protecting children from abuse. Similarly, we need bipartisan support for prevention and treatment to cut demand and help Americans struggling with addiction to combat deadly illicit fentanyl. But Republicans continue to ignore the facts by incorrectly linking illicit fentanyl trafficking with undocumented immigration. Less than 0.1% of people who cross the border illegally possess any fentanyl whatsoever. We also have a labor shortage across the entire workforce. And it's apparent that America needs immigrants to reach our economic potential. Republicans should recognize and celebrate immigrants' countless contributions to our workforce rather than demean immigrants as burdens. For example, 25% of recent U.S. startups are created by immigrants. We have important work to do on this Energy and Commerce Committee, strengthening our pandemic preparedness, addressing drug shortages, eliminating climate pollution, protecting our privacy, to name a few. So let's get back to the real work of effective governing rather than engaging in political theater in this committee. So thank you, and I yield back my time.
Generally yields back. Now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for her 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. America is less secure today because of President Biden's border crisis. The administration's failure to enforce the law is harming the American people. Our open borders have far-reaching consequences on our nation's economy, our healthcare system, and our education system. The Biden administration's refusal to act is a failure of leadership to protect and defend our nation. Americans' faith and trust in their government suffers as a result. Last December, the Pew Research poll showed that 67% of Americans are not confident in the president's ability to make wise decisions about immigration policies. Last year, this subcommittee traveled to McAllen, Texas, where we saw the consequences of unprotected borders up close. And after witnessing what I saw there, I was deeply troubled. I had trouble sleeping. We talked with everyday Americans who were struggling to deal with their new reality of overwhelmed hospitals and schools. We toured a path by the cartels to smuggle migrants and illegal drugs into the United States. And we met with Border Patrol personnel who shared how frustrated they are with this administration's policies, which are making their jobs nearly impossible. In the year since our hearing, the crisis has only worsened. The Biden border crisis is allowing records amount of fentanyl to pour into our communities. More people than ever are dying from fentanyl poisoning. It remains the leading cause of death for Americans between ages of 18 and 45. A record 74.5 million fentanyl pills were seized just last year. While some may celebrate this, the sad truth is for every batch seized, more slips through undetected, and more lives are lost. That's the message Molly Keene shared with our committee last year after her son, Carson, took a pill he thought would help his anxiety. It turned out to be laced with a lethal dose of fentanyl. No one should feel the pain Molly felt. More can and must be done. President Biden's border crisis is not only harming border communities, it's harming every community across the country. America's largest cities, often run by politicians who once proudly declared their cities to be so-called sanctuary cities, are now begging migrants not to come and pleading with the administration to do something. New York City's homeless population is at an all-time high, fueled by the constant arrival of more migrants. The migrant influx is projected to cost New York City alone $12 billion over 3 years. And the governor of New York announced just yesterday that she wants to spend another $2.4 billion from the state to care for a massive increase in migrants. And that's on top of the nearly $2 billion the state already allocated in emergency funds. Just this past week, students in New York City were sent home and told to return to remote learning, all because their school had to be converted into a temporary shelter for nearly 2,000 migrants. President Biden's open border agenda is unsustainable, irresponsible, and inhumane. The problems at our southern border could be mitigated in part by enforcing existing immigration laws this administration is choosing to ignore. House Republicans have made securing our border a top priority and passed sweeping border protection legislation at the start of this Congress. H.R. 2 would go a long way to solving the Biden border crisis. But unfortunately, President Biden and the Senate Democrats continue to show little interest in a solution. House Republicans also passed the Halt Fentanyl Act, led by Chairs Griffith and Latta, to permanently give our law enforcement the tools they need to keep deadly fentanyl off our streets. The Senate must take action. Every day they do not means another day that communities across the country struggle with the toll of the Biden border crisis. The American people deserve better. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Thank you so much. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's clear that an election year has begun. We all know that immigration reform is long overdue, but this hearing demonstrates that my Republican colleagues are in full-blown election mode, turning to scare tactics and fear-mongering. They entitled this hearing "A Threat to Every Community," a suggestion that those who are crossing our border are somehow all violent criminals. And yes, we need to improve our immigration system, but the best way to tackle illegal immigration is to create a wider path to legal immigration. Suggesting that immigrants are some kind of threat to our society is nonsense. It only serves to further harmful and dangerous stereotypes, and Republicans are once again putting politics over people, refusing once again to work with Democrats to fix our broken system. Immigration reform is essential. Our economy relies on the innovation and hard work that immigrants bring to this country. We need more legal pathways to citizenship and a more efficient process that reduces the strain that we see at the border. And while I reject the notion that all immigrants at the border present a threat to our communities, we do need to make sure that our Border Patrol is adequately resourced so they can focus on the actual security threats that they may encounter at the border. But because House Republicans have failed to put forward anything resembling realistic immigration reform that could become law and really make a difference, they're now focused on impeaching the Secretary of Homeland Security. And this is nothing but a waste of time and is being done purely for political revenge. And this committee has broad jurisdiction that's essential to our economy and lowering costs for consumers and ensuring the health and well-being of Americans. We tackle some of the most complicated matters: healthcare, energy and the environment, telecommunications and the internet, and consumer protection. But what this committee does not have is jurisdiction over border policy. Using this committee to smear President Biden's response to issues at the border, I think, is a blatant attempt to distract from the work that this Congress has failed to get done under Republican leadership. The Republican leadership so far has refused to reauthorize the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, failed to act on pipeline safety reauthorization, and failed to provide our public health institutions with the authorities they need to help alleviate harmful drug shortages. I know that the committee has worked on this. I'm not suggesting that our committee leadership hasn't worked on it, but the bills come out of here and then they don't pass the House. They don't get put on the floor, even when the bills are bipartisan and everybody on the committee has voted for them. And these are some of the issues that we should be focused on, addressing together. But instead, the Republican leadership continues to cave to the extreme elements of their party who have absolutely no interest in governing. And House Republicans' extreme approach to fixing the issues on the border, I think, are cruel, inhumane, and ineffective. They've also shown no interest in working with the Biden administration to solve the problem. Time and time again, Republicans have ignored the Biden administration's request for resources to secure the border in a serious and responsible way. President Biden has asked for funding for 1,300 more border agents, 1,000 more Customs and Border Protection officers to focus on countering fentanyl, 1,600 more asylum officers, and numerous more support staff and resources to humanely and effectively address migration along the southern border. So if my Republican colleagues are really interested in keeping Americans safe and our community strong and our constituents healthy and our economy growing, they would stop trying to slash the very federal agencies and programs that keep our country safe, healthy, and prosperous. So again, the House Republican leadership is not interested in bipartisan solutions to this issue. They prefer scare tactics to deflect from the failure to govern. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. That concludes member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record. Please provide those to the clerk promptly. Well, we want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. I would also thank you all for working with us on the delayed start time on this. I know some of you that probably had to inconvenience, and we do apologize, but trying to get as many members here as possible. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement of 5 minutes, followed by a round of questions from the members. Our witnesses today are Robert Rector, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome back. Ammon Blair, a former Border Patrol agent and Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Councilwoman Vernikov, New York City Council. And Alex Norasta, Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing from each of you. You are aware this subcommittee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, we have the practice of taking the testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to testifying under oath? Seeing no objection from the witnesses, we will proceed. The Chair further advises you you're entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? All right, and seeing that none have indicated a desire for counsel, we'll move forward. If each of you would rise and raise your right hand, please. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Seeing the witnesses answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and are under oath. You may be seated. You're sworn in and under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Rector for his 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's on. How's that? It says it's on. Okay, I'll shout. In the 3 years since taking office, the Biden administration has encouraged and facilitated the entry of 6.7 million illegal immigrants to enter and take up residence in the United States. This number is not some fanciful press release. I calculated these directly from the government's own statistics released by the Office of Homeland Security Statistics. The impact of Biden's policy can be seen by comparing the current situation with prior presidencies. In FY 2023, there were 3.2 million encounters between illegal aliens and, between illegal aliens and the government nationwide. In 2016, the last year of the Obama administration, there were only 700,000 such encounters. So this is a 460% increase. In fact, if you looked at the last month, September of FY 2023, the Obama administration admitted 201,000 illegal immigrants, released them in the United States. In the entire year of FY 2016, Obama released 57,000. So we released 4 times as many people in a single month under Biden as Obama released in an entire year. In fact, this is very close to saying in a typical week, Obama is releasing more illegal immigrants to reside in the United States than Obama did in an entire fiscal year. As a statistician, as a social scientist, is absolutely unprecedented. These numbers, as I look at them, as they come out of the government, not out of press releases and public statements, but out of the government itself, they're simply astonishing. And this huge surge in the number of encounters and releases is the direct result of Biden policies which deliberately encourage, facilitate, and reward illegal immigration. Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas recently admitted to his agents that some 85% of current encounters with illegals result in the individual being released into the interior. The government's own data show, as I said, of the hundreds and thousands of millions of inadmissible aliens encountered by the border on the southwest, 83% are currently being released. 83%. That's not for the whole period, but it's what's happening now. This policy that we have today is not so much what we used to call catch and release. This is greet and release. And what is being demanded here of the conservatives is that you fund more government money for greet and release. That will increase the inflow of illegal immigrants, not bring it down. If current policies are continued, at least 10 million additional illegal aliens will enter and take up residence in the United States over the next 5 years. The only response from the Biden administration is to pretend that this is reality isn't even happening. In general, illegal immigrants in the United States have low levels of education. For example, at least 40% of illegal immigrants lack a high school degree, compared to 6% of U.S. citizens. This means that they receive have low wages, high levels of government benefits, receiving about $2.40 in benefits for every dollar of taxes paid. As a group, illegal immigrants currently impose a net fiscal cost, government benefits received minus taxes paid, of $110 billion on the U.S. taxpayer every year. How much is $110 billion? Well, it's equivalent of an 82-cent tax on every gallon of gasoline sold in the United States. The left not only supports this massive ongoing influx of over 2 million illegal immigrants a year, they want to grant them amnesty. And if you granted them amnesty, according to the National Academy of Sciences, the net cost of that would be $5 trillion over a lifetime. That's roughly the equivalent of $50,000 for every tax-paying household in the United States. It's simply extraordinary. What we have to realize is, according to polls, there are 1 billion people that would like to come and live in the United States. You cannot have open borders. You cannot have a border policy that simply greets over and over again and releases into the interior people that will never leave. In addition, the current policy that we have of widespread low-skill immigration, according to the National Academy of Sciences, deliberately and strongly presses down the wages and employment of the least skilled American workers, particularly black male workers. According to research reported by the National Academy of Sciences, current low-skill immigration, both legal and illegal, has probably cut the wages and earnings of our lowest-skilled workers by 30%, okay? This in terms has all kinds of widespread impact in terms of poverty, family breakup, welfare dependence, and so forth and so on. Our policy needs to set American workers first, not people who come here illegally from abroad. And we cannot have a policy of open borders when 1 billion people want to come and enter this country. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I'll now recognize Mr. Ammon Blair. I will take a point of personal privilege before we start your 5 minutes and just say that I like the name probably because Ammon Tharp was a member of Bill Dill and the Rondells before he had his own band, and two of the biggest bands in the Mid-Atlantic during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Mr. Blair, if you can sing, we'll hear that too, but first let's get your testimony.
I cannot sing.
All right.
Yeah. All right, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chairwoman Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, and distinguished members of the committee. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to testify today. As a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I bring 22 years of military experience and a deep understanding of border security from my time in the Army and U.S. Border Patrol. My roles have ranged from infantry officer in Operation Lone Star to collateral intelligence agent and Marine Border Patrol agent. I've been on the frontiers of combating drug trafficking and illegal immigration, and I have also coordinated efforts to border wall construction. In recent years, I have personally witnessed a noteworthy evolution in the security and stability of our border region. The nature of the challenges confronting us has transformed, necessitating proactive engagement and a comprehensive reevaluation of our strategies. Is the border secure? Who has operational control? Is there a crisis? Is every town a border town? How do we know? On the surface, these categorizations might appear a mere semantic distinctions, but they are not. Despite advancements in homeland security efforts, the border remains shrouded in ambiguity with pervasive uncertainty. A significant challenge also arises from the absence of standardized definitions for Mexican cartel border crimes and the spillover of violence. We need to recognize the multifaceted and interconnected nature of the threats we face and devise a comprehensive and coordinated strategy to counter them. The FY 2017 NDAA was the first legislation to codify border security metrics. Under this legislation, DHS is mandated to annually report on 43 distinct measures, yet these measures predominantly capture immigration statistics. By prioritizing immigration metrics, the federal government shifted public perception. The border environment is viewed almost exclusively through the lens of immigration and migration. This limited perspective overshadows and thus undermines more extensive national security threats. The United States is facing an unprecedented crisis at its southern border. Under the current administration, there have been over 6.2 million illegal crossings of our southern border and 7.5 million enforcement encounters nationwide. Many are lured by false promises and incentives from the Biden administration. The Biden administration created the conditions for this weaponization of mass migration by reversing the policies of the previous administration that deterred and prevented illegal immigration, such as the Remain in Mexico program, the asylum cooperation agreements with Central American countries, and border wall construction. Instead, the current administration has offered illegal aliens various incentives, such as benefits of parole, flights, transportation, or other monetary benefits to induce them to leave their countries and head to the U.S. border. The current vetting process and screening process for illegal aliens at the border is not only illegal but also dangerous. It creates loopholes and incentives for migrants to enter the country illegally without proper documentation or verification. It also allows criminals and terrorists to exploit the system and evade detection. According to the Department of Homeland Security, some of the illegal aliens who have been apprehended at the border have been found to have ties to transnational criminal organizations such as drug cartels, human traffickers, and gangs. Some of them have also been found to have links to terrorist groups such as ISIS, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda. DHS relies heavily on various technologies and infrastructure to enhance its border security efforts, such as ground sensors, fences, and camera towers. My experience with the border fence has led to several conclusions. The first is that left unprotected, any physical barrier will be defeated. For a physical barrier to be effective, quick detection of attempted breaches and rapid law enforcement response before significant damage can be done are necessary. Application of technology can allow for real-time detections with minimal manpower requirements. The border wall has proven to be an effective deterrent in areas where it is up to date and properly maintained. But in order for the wall to reach its maximum effectiveness, it must be finished. In areas where the wall is incomplete or lacking proper technology, people can simply walk around it. While a wall cannot be the only tool in the border security toolbox, it provides a significant benefit to border enforcement personnel and the security of not only border states, but America as a whole. The U.S.-Mexico border is not only a physical barrier, but also a battleground for a covert war between the Mexican cartels and the U.S. authorities. The cartels have devised a cunning strategy to evade detection and prosecution by creating a sanitary zone inside the Texas border where they can operate with impunity and use the local population as their pawns. The cartels exploit the legal loopholes and the social vulnerabilities of the border communities, especially minors and gangs, to smuggle drugs, weapons, money, and people across the border. The cartels also employ sophisticated technology, such as drones, to monitor and evade law enforcement agencies. The DEA identifies several U.S. cities where the Mexican cartels have a significant presence or influence, such as L.A., Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and Houston. The Mexican cartels pose a serious threat to U.S. national security and American communities. The U.S. opioid crisis is not only a public health emergency, but also a national security threat. Behind the scenes, the Chinese Communist Party is weaponizing the Mexican cartels in the U.S. by supplying them with precursor chemicals and synthetic drugs, such as fentanyl, that are used to produce and traffic deadly opioids across the border. Conclusion. To solve this border crisis, we need a joint effort from federal and state agencies. They must work together to create consistent definitions, improve data collection methods, and increase transparency. Only by defining and understanding the problem can we devise a solution. We, the American people, have the right and the duty to defend our nation and our values. We cannot let our border crisis become our national downfall. We must act now before it is too late. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Appreciate that. Now recognize Councilwoman Ina Vernikov for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify here today. As we sit here today to explore the impacts of President Biden's border policies, I appear before you not just as an elected official, but also as a Ukrainian-born American Jew whose family immigrated to the United States as Jewish refugees 28 years ago. Before I entered public office, I was a proud owner of a matrimonial and immigration law practice in which thousands of immigration clients walked through my doors. Those immigrants came to the United States using different channels. Some entered through legal means and some did not. Regardless of their status, I zealously represented each and every one of them. America was built by freedom-loving immigrants from all corners of the world who escaped genocide, dictatorships, political and religious persecutions in search of a brighter future and who endlessly worked to achieve their American dream. I do not take for granted that I'm only privileged to sit here before you because this great country gave me and families like mine opportunities we would have never had anywhere else on earth. But it is because of my love for this country that I have never been more concerned for her future like I am today. What once was a point of bipartisan agreements has become a political battlefield of contention. We once believed that the privilege of being an American citizen should be achieved by lawful means, but that is not the case today. Because of the massive influx of migrants from the southern border, New York City is at a breaking point. In fact, our mayor, Eric Adams, said, and I quote, "This issue will destroy New York City." The current migrant crisis has already placed a significant strain on every area of life for New Yorkers, including our schools, the economy, our healthcare system, and public safety. The influx of migrants into New York City has added nearly 34,000 new students to our public school system over the past 2 years. Districts across the city have been scrambling to meet the learning, health, and emotional needs of these students, most of whom require specialized instruction. This is happening as our students are still trying to recover from the significant learning losses caused by pandemic school closures. To add to the strain in our system, school facilities have also been utilized for housing as the city scrambles to accommodate the massive numbers of new arrivals. Last week, we witnessed a perfect example of how President Biden's border policies are impacting our communities when a local high school of close to 4,000 children became an overnight migrant shelter. A Siena poll found that 70% of New York City residents are concerned about becoming a victim of a serious crime. Those entering our country through the border are not properly vetted, as their criminal records from their home countries are mostly unknown. Since Hamas has launched a brutal massacre on innocent civilians in Israel on October 7th, the world has been paying more attention to terrorist organizations and their activity. This past October, a Department of Homeland Security memo was circulated to staff, warning that individuals inspired by terror groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah may be attempting to travel through the southern border to the United States. 169 individuals on the FBI watch list were encountered at the southern border in the year 2023 alone. That is more than the last 6 fiscal years combined. As someone who represents one of the largest constituencies of Jewish New Yorkers, this is particularly frightening, especially amidst the despicable rise in anti-Semitism in our city and country. However, make no mistake, Hamas sympathizers are a threat to every New Yorker and every American. Local communities surrounding migrant shelters are also justifiably concerned by an uptick in crime. Just last week, several men were charged with stabbing another man to death in Randall's Island, one of several tent cities constructed to house migrants across the city. The violent incidents prompted the city to impose a curfew and consider adding metal detectors at these shelters. The migrant crisis has also placed an enormous strain on the city's public hospital system, with New York City hospitals receiving over 30,000 undocumented migrant visits in the past year alone. As of April of last year, 50% of migrants coming into New York City were not vaccinated against the contagious polio virus, a virus that we have more or less eradicated in the United States. According to New York City Health Commissioner Vassan, the migrants come in from and pass through countries with high rates of infectious tuberculosis. With no end in sight, our city is projected to spend $10.6 billion of taxpayer money on the migrant crisis through fiscal year 2025, and we face projected 2.5 budget cuts across all city agencies. More than 170,000 undocumented aliens have come through the city's intake system since spring of 2023, with nearly 70,000 of them currently in our care, according to the last data provided by the administration. Our mayor called this an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. It's far more than that. It's a national crisis. The current situation is unsustainable, unmanageable, and unaffordable. We cannot allow this administration to pursue its path of inaction and destructive policies as they continue prioritizing undocumented foreigners who circumvent a legal system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and now recognize Alex Narasta for his 5 minutes opening statement.
Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Alex Narasta, and I am the Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, a nonpartisan public policy research organization in Washington, D.C. It is an honor to be invited to speak with you today about the safety, health, and economic consequences of President Biden's border policies. Chaos along the southwest border is a serious problem caused by 2 factors. The first factor is the strength of the U.S. economy. U.S. employers demand foreign labor, employers are willing to pay high wages, and foreign workers want to come. The second factor is that it is impossible for the vast majority of would-be migrants to come here illegally. As a result, many migrants break American immigration laws to earn an average of about 300% higher wages than they would in their home countries. These 2 factors combine to produce the border chaos that we are witnessing today. The first factor is high demand for foreign workers and their willingness to come, which will not change anytime soon. But the second factor, our severely restrictive legal immigration system, is an artificial creation by past Congresses, created contrary to free market principles and implemented in a way that causes maximum chaos. The simplified chart of the legal immigration system included in my submitted testimony is so complex and restrictive that even the most sober-minded Soviet central planner would blush upon seeing it. Legal permanent immigration to the United States was equal to about 0.27% of the U.S. population in 2021 and 2022. Of the 26 OECD countries with complete available data, the United States is in 23rd place, between South Korea and France. This is a scandal for a country that rightly prides itself as a nation of immigrants. Our immigration restrictions are a scandal for a country where practically everyone, including everyone in this room, can point back to ancestors who arrived on these shores at some point in the past or immigrated here themselves. Congress and the Biden administration can remedy this scandal and thereby reduce chaos along the border to a small fraction of what it currently is. The simplest, cheapest, and quickest way to reduce illegal immigration is to vastly expand legal immigration to the United States. The Biden administration actually shows us that this can be done and that it would reduce the chaos. In January of 2023, the Biden administration expanded parole to some U.S.-sponsored migrants from Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, the so-called CVNH program. The result was a massive decline in the number of border crossers from those countries, as many of them instead entered the U.S. on parole, lawfully. There was a 62.4% decline in Border Patrol encounters of migrants from the CVNH countries in the entire post-CVNH period for which we have data. At the same time, the number of Border Patrol encounters of migrants from other countries stayed the same. The lesson is clear. The border could be under control tomorrow if Congress and the Biden administration were willing to substantially increase legal immigration. And expanding immigration will reduce border chaos and economically benefit Americans. Immigrants increase economic growth without negatively affecting American wages. Immigrants paid about $1.43 in taxes for every dollar they consumed in government benefits at the state, local, and federal levels combined in 2018. Local problems, such as the cost of sheltering migrants in New York City, are caused by, frankly, insane right-to-shelter laws enacted by state and local governments or forced upon them through old legal compromises and court decisions that can and should be overturned now. Border chaos is a policy choice. Border chaos is an unintentional and predictable consequence of a strong economy and a severely restrictive legal immigration policy. Border chaos was chosen long ago by past Congresses when they heavily restricted legal immigration, and chaos is chosen every second the Biden administration delays in expanding parole. Please do not keep choosing border chaos over expanding legal immigration. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I will now move into the question and answering portion of the hearing, and I'll begin the questioning, recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Norasta, wasn't that policy the one that was crafted back in the 1960s by Ted Kennedy? Isn't that the one you're referring to that needs to be changed? I agree with you that it needs to be changed, but isn't that the policy?
The last major update was in 1990. There was a major reform in 65, which is, I believe, the one you're referring to.
That's the one I'm referring to. That set the bones of what we have now. Mr. Rector, let me ask you a couple questions. In regard to legal immigration, if we just had legal immigration, we expanded that a little bit, we'd still have a southern border, would we? A problem, would we not?
We absolutely would. As I indicated, polls show 1 billion people would like to come and live here, okay? And Cato basically is an open border institution. They've never answered what happens when the 1 billion people want to come here under open borders. And yes, you would continue to have this exact same problem.
And didn't this problem
have very high levels of legal
and didn't this problem exist during the Reagan administration, and they tried to make a deal, and the part of the deal was they'd build a wall and they got the immigration, but they didn't get the wall? Isn't that?
They were supposed to get all kinds of security things, in particular E-Verify, which we've never had, was the key. But Ed Meese told me that that was the worst decision the Reagan administration ever made, to make a deal of say, oh, we're going to give you amnesty and we're going to get all these security things, and they got nothing. We're still waiting for E-Verify since 1996.
And Mr. Blair, you talked a little bit in your testimony about the wall. While it wouldn't solve all the problems, wouldn't the wall be extremely helpful along the southern border to help reduce the number of illegal immigrants who are coming into this country?
Yes, sir.
And do you agree with Mr. Rector that what we have instead of the catch and release, we really have, greet and release?
Yes, sir.
All right. Ms. Vernikov, related to the school children, because I have school, I know, I don't look like I could, but I do. I have some school-age children still. Was there any input from the parents of the students from the school where New York placed the illegal immigrants in to house them before, saying you're going to go to virtual learning?
Yeah, there was a lot of outrage from the parents of the school. There are 4,000 students that go to James Madison. We warned about what's going to happen in Floyd Bennett if they were to keep migrants at Floyd Bennett Center. There was going to be inclement weather, and they would have to move the children. It was a last-minute decision to move them into the school. We had to dismiss kids early. They had to go remote the next day. They canceled sports practice, and it's just not a good practice to have our schools become migrant shelters, even if it's for one night. The parents had no other choice, no other options as to what to do with their children the next day.
And so it disrupted not only the sports practice, but it also disrupted the athletic adventures? And so the swimming team didn't get to go swim, getting to do their meets? And
I
so
don't know
forth.
about the specific
All
sports,
right.
but definitely practice was canceled.
And where that becomes significant is if some of those kids are trying to get a scholarship. Isn't that true?
Absolutely.
And then you were an immigration lawyer. Isn't it true that with this flood of illegal immigrants coming in, that we're actually putting those who are trying to do it legally at the back of the line instead of processing them in a timely fashion?
We're absolutely prioritizing illegal immigration over law-abiding citizens. We had to wait, my family and I had to wait 3 years just to see our grandparents. We did everything by the law. We followed the legal system, and that's how it should be done in the United States of America.
I appreciate that. Mr. Blair, I've been particularly interested in unaccompanied minors. Can you explain to the American people what happens and what your experience was at the U.S. border when an unaccompanied minor crosses the border and how Border Patrol hands the child off to HHS or the Office of Refugee Resettlement?
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, it's an everyday occurrence, and it happens all the time, all across the border. Typically, the child automatically has either an address of where they're going to, a name, and that name may be associated with them as a familial, as someone from their family, but it could also be someone that's also a trafficker or someone else. We really don't know. So at that time period, we have to take the knowledge that child has, that limited knowledge, process them, and then hand them off.
And are you aware that when OR gets them, they don't do an actual background check with fingerprints on the sponsors? They don't do a home check. They've now made it optional that you can do a virtual check, but that there's no requirement that they check or that they notify the local school division or the local Department of Social Services that this child is being placed in their area. Are you aware of that?
Correct. Just not on first-hand accounts, just on other accounts. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, it's been widely reported. My time is up. I could go on for hours on these issues. They're extremely important to America long-term, and I appreciate you all being here today, and I yield back and now recognize Ms. Castor for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America's immigration laws are outdated. Decades since we've been able to modernize and do something in a bipartisan way. So really, I hope this would be an impetus for Congress to come together to fix it. Mr. Narasta, you've said ultimately that the best way to reduce illegal immigration is to address our laws. And especially to fix legal immigration. How has Congress's failure to create updated legal pathways to citizenship, to work, exacerbated the issues of our broken immigration system?
By failing to expand legal opportunities for migrants to come to the United States to work lawfully, you are giving a tremendous incentive to migrants to instead come unlawfully to work. The U.S. labor market is in a tremendous historical situation in terms of how well it's doing. The number of job openings for the last period of time we have data is over 8 million. During the Biden administration, it's hovered around an average of about 9.9 million, which is historically high. Unemployment is low, below 4%. Wages are rising. This is the labor market that demands and craves workers, and as a result, that is a magnet for migrants to come to the U.S. And because they, the vast majority of them, there is no legal pathway for them to come lawfully, a lot of them have decided to come unlawfully. And all of the Border Patrol agents in the world, all of the walls in the world are not going to stop that flow. To be fair, enforcement makes a difference. But standing athwart market forces and trying to yell stop is not an effective strategy. The effective strategy, just like it was to end prohibition, to legalize by legalizing alcohol, is to legalize immigration.
This is what I hear from businesses back home and across the state of Florida. They're hungry for workers, and it's even led to where the Florida legislature is considering a bill to loosen child labor laws this legislative session. But the Biden administration has tried to use some new initiatives like parole, as we talked about for Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaragua, Haiti. Have you seen, you detailed a few statistics in your remarks. Are these ways to create legal pathways, have they truly had an impact on deterring illegal immigration?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually a very clear, it's one of the most clear things I've seen, or examples, quasi-natural experiments, which is the term I use as an economist, ever, is taking a look at the parole programs announced for Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Nicaraguans and Haitians. I mean, we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of illegal immigrants from those countries coming to the border by 62%. In the 11 months that we have data for since the enactment of those programs, compared to the previous 11-month period. And what's remarkable to this is you can draw a graph, and it doesn't get any clearer than this in social science. The number of apprehensions of people from other countries or encounters along the border is flat on average over that period. But for these people from CVNH countries, it has cratered, it has collapsed. If you're interested in getting control of the border, reducing the chaos, this is a path forward. This is the way to do it.
And then under that initiative, you have to have a sponsor in the U.S. who is financially responsible for you, and you get a pathway to work. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So what do you recommend? What is the most effective step or steps that Congress can work on in a bipartisan way right now to deter illegal immigration?
So for Congress, I think the way for them to work going forward is to expand legal immigration opportunities and temporary migration opportunities. For example, expanding the H-2 visa programs, H-2A and H-2B, for temporary migrant workers, by allowing American states to work in conjunction with the federal government to sponsor migrants for their own state needs. There was actually a bill introduced by Representative Curtis some years ago to create a state-based migrant visa pilot program to allow that kind of flexibility. Also to reduce the regulations, to reduce the amount of labor market compliance that employers have to use in order to sponsor migrants, and to generally expand the numbers across the board for every existing visa that is out there, as well as, I think, and for the administration, I would say, the answer in the short term is to expand parole, both by expanding the numbers available every month for the CVNH countries, but also to expand parole opportunities to folks from other countries in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, to reduce the strain and reduce the numbers of people heading to the border so that Border Patrol can get control over the border.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Dr. Burgess of Texas for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rector, can I ask you, what is the number of people that immigrate to this country legally every year?
I think it's over 1 million a year.
I think it's 1.1 million is
Okay,
what I've been
right.
told. So in my tenure in Congress, that's almost 30, I've been here 20 years, so that's almost 30 million people who've been brought into the country legally. Mr. Blair, we heard some complaints early on in the testimony about what Texas has done down on the border and specifically in regards to the park that now the Texas Medical Department has taken over from Customs and Border Protection, and the fact that that might have led to several drownings on Friday night. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yes, sir, I do have knowledge.
Can you tell us?
Sure. So if you look at the newest reports, Texas Military Department wasn't notified until after the fact. So unfortunately, when you do protect the border, and when illegal aliens try to cross that border, and it is protected, the Rio Grande River, it's quite fast. And so I've seen illegal aliens personally drown. And us as Border Patrol agents try to do our very best to try to mitigate that effort, and so would TMD. But the problem is, regardless of what wall or barrier they're going to try to cross, whether there is a wall or not, and they have drowned also whether there was a wall or not.
But the actions that Texas had taken specifically because the Biden administration will not take any action, so Governor Abbott felt compelled to protect his state, those actions were not the direct cause of the tragedy that occurred Friday night, were they?
No, sir, the direct cause were by those who wanted to cross, and also by the Mexican cartels who also dictate where they're going to cross.
And that is exactly right. No one steps into that river unless they have permission from the cartel. Is that not correct?
Correct. All along the border, you're going to have plazas. So Mexican cartels, whether that's all the way down from Brownsville all the way to California, there are different cartels, and they control the plazas, and they control every movement, whether that's going to be illicit narcotics, whether it's going to be humans, arms trafficking. They control every aspect of that area. Now, certain cartels, they do things differently. So you're going to see more warring in the state of Tamaulipas than you are going to see near Eagle Pass area. But as reports have been brought out, especially by the Center for Immigration Studies, they've been able to go down there inside of Mexico to also show that there's also local law enforcement inside of Mexico that was also aiding and abetting and also guiding the illegal aliens coming up into the U.S.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, like Mr. Griffith, I was down in McAllen a year ago and we had a field hearing in McAllen. I was in Eagle Pass with the speaker a week ago. And the phenomenal thing about a week ago down in Eagle Pass, I mean, you've seen the pictures of the phenomenal number of people that were sort of in these queues along the riverbank. But when we got down there, there's absolutely no one to be seen. And I put this in the broad category of the cartels are not stupid. You've got the Speaker of the House coming down to do a major photo op. Let's not flood the zone with illegal immigrants at that point. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
That, and you also need to see in that specific area, the NGOs south of that location, as well as the government. As I said, there have been reports showing exactly that they're metering the illegal aliens into that area. So at that specific time, they did not have anyone come across, other than you guys did see one raft.
And this is what's really frustrating. It demonstrates that the problem can be controlled, but it is a decision not to control. It's a willful neglect on the part of the Biden administration. Before I run out of time, Councilwoman, I have to ask you, I've been very concerned since this subcommittee has been working on this problem for a number of years. We were the ones that identified that there was a problem with unvaccinated children back in 2014, problems with tuberculosis in 2014. You've referenced that there may be some difficulties in New York because of tuberculosis and now polio, as I understand it. Is that not correct?
That's correct, and the schools are not mandating that migrant children are vaccinated, so the health officials are really concerned about a potential spread of a disease.
So one of the reasons you have a border, and there are reasons to have a border, but one of the reasons you have a border is to protect your citizens from disease, correct? You control the border so that you control disease that might spread amongst the population. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert two articles that I have into the record, one dealing with the drownings and the other one dealing with how Mexico is metering the number of people who are coming across. And ask unanimous consent to have those as part of the record.
Reserving the right to object.
Right to object is reserved, and we'll take that up at the end of the hearing. Gentleman yields back.
Yeah, it's a CNN article for crying out loud.
Now, yeah, but they just want to
But
look
the
at it.
gentleman didn't say that.
Yeah, they just want to look at it. Now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So the chairman said in his opening statement, the first thing he said, a little defensively, I thought, was that the border isn't just a talking point. But my question is, if the border is not just a talking point, why won't the Republicans work with us to actually fix this problem? And let me explain what I'm talking about. In October last year, October 20th, President Biden submitted to Congress a $106 billion emergency national security funding package with $14.45 billion for the southern border, plus aid for Ukraine, Israel, the Indo-Pacific, and humanitarian aid. Now, here's what the requested funding for the southern border would do. It would have critical border enforcement activities. And let me take a moment to say, every single person in this room thinks, except for a few, think we need to have a secure border. We all can agree with that. And the Democrats, at least, would like to have a bipartisan solution to this. And we would like to have that solution sooner rather than later. We have a divided government. I don't think the House Republicans have quite realized that, not just with respect to immigration, but everything, because you have to compromise if you're going to get something done. So here's what President Biden wanted as part of the supplemental package. An additional 1,300 Border Patrol agents to work along with existing budget agents. An additional 1,600 asylum officers and associated support staff so that we could have facilitate timely immigration dispositions. So we wouldn't have people who came in under an asylum provision and then have to wait for years before they could get their cases heard. Additional detention beds to sustain our currently significant increased use of expedited removal and provide necessary surge capacity, requesting funding for transportation to send these people who don't qualify back to their home countries, new non-custodial housing options for non-citizens in expedited removal, so we don't have to send people to high schools in New York to sleep when it's freezing cold, and their alternative would be to have the children sleeping on the street. Additional attorneys and support staff to match the 375 new immigration judge teams to adjudicate these people quickly and send them back, and on and on. No, the Republicans will not agree to that. They will not even agree to negotiate to that. Speaker Johnson said this morning that the deal that the Republicans and Democrats and the White House are working on over in the Senate is a non-starter. And he said the only thing he will accept is H.R. 2. Now, I have to say, if we really want to solve immigration issues, I agree we need to do it. And Ms. Vernikov, you're an immigration lawyer, so you know that if somebody is legitimately claiming asylum, they have a right to do that. But we have to be able to, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to comment on this. I'm just saying, when they come in and they claim asylum, they have a right to that, and we need to expedite that case. And the other thing I will say, I've heard a whole bunch of tropes from this panel today that I think we need to dispose of. Number one, when people come into this country, they don't get immediately federal aid. They don't get health care aid. They don't get transportation. The transportation is being paid for by people like Governor Abbott, who are sending migrants to Denver, Colorado, and New York City, and all of these other places with apparently Texas state money. We need to get a grip on this. We need to have comprehensive immigration policy, or at the very least, we need to put the resources down there on the border so that we can enforce our laws. Nobody disagrees with that, but instead, the Republican majority has decided to take this week to and maybe there's polling been done, I don't know what it is, but they've decided to take this week to somehow say that President Biden and the Democrats don't want to work on immigration reform. That is simply untrue. And I think we need to work together, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to work together to find an immigration policy that we can all agree on. And what I tell my constituents all the time when they ask me about this, everybody needs to take a deep breath. We need to figure out what our needs are in this country for employment. We need to have short-term visas, long-term visas, and we need to enforce our border. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and since you referenced me, I'll just say that when we stop, greet, and release, we might be able to start working on something. But I would also remind her that we've had numerous hearings in this committee, particularly related to OR. Now recognize the gentlelady, the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fact of the matter is, there's record numbers coming across the border, millions. And as simple as President Biden saying he would put Remain in Mexico in place, that would stop 70% of those that are coming across the border, it's estimated. So this is a very important hearing. This is not new. The Republicans have been asking for the administration to get serious about securing the border for several years now. And the fact of the matter is, we're having huge impacts on our country because of an unprecedented border crisis. The number of individuals who are coming across the border now, it's the size of major cities like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. And it's the decisions that have been made by this administration that has brought us to this point. So, Mr. Rector, I wanted to start with you. Can you describe for us the size of this wave that is coming versus previous administrations?
Absolutely unprecedented. You've got a minimum of 2 million people coming in and being released. Of all the people appearing on the border, Mayorkas has said that 85% of them are directly released into the country. And that's not just a statement, that's verified by the actual statistics that they release. And it's absolutely unprecedented. As I said, basically, if you look at the last month of reported data, on the southwest border alone, we let in 200,000 and released them in a month. In 2016, Obama, in the entire year, let in and released 57,000. So we're releasing on a weekly basis almost as much as Obama released in an entire year. And there's no stopping this. And these policies to facilitate and spend even more money on greet and release will what? They're going to motivate more and more people to show up. You're paying for people to come in and migrate. And I just noticed this, that they don't get health care. Of course they get free health care. They get free health care from the minute they enter this country, okay? And they get tons of other things as well. It's outrageous to say something like that. There are 10,000 federally funded national health centers that across the country that provide free primary care to every single illegal immigrant.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilwoman Vernikov, your district is 2,000 miles from the southern border. Despite this distance, the migrant crisis recently disrupted a high school in New York City. Can you tell us what happened?
Sure. Floyd Benefield has been used as a tent for migrants. There are about 2,000 migrants currently living at Floyd Benefield. It's not in my district, but it's in a neighboring district. Because of inclement weather, they had to move the migrants to a safer location, and they decided to use a school, James Madison High School, in my district, to move them there. As I said earlier, students had to be dismissed early. They went remote. Practice had to be canceled. And it caused a huge inconvenience for the parents. They were very outraged. Also, it caused a lot of commotion to the local residents. They felt unsafe. They weren't sure what the plan was. All of this happened last minute. This was extremely disruptive to the learning environment. And parents are really concerned, quite frankly, that this is going to happen again. Is it going to happen at this school? Is it going to happen at other schools? What's the plan? There's no plan. It's very, very disturbing.
Thank you. I can only imagine how disruptive that is on students and on the parents. Councilwoman, New York City Mayor Eric Adams recently said in a town hall, quote, "I'm going to tell you something, New Yorkers. Never in my life have I had a problem I didn't see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City." End of quote. Mayor Adams also said, quote, "We have no more room." Do you agree with Mayor Adams' assessment that President Biden's border policy is destroying New York City?
Absolutely. It's touching on every area of life. Hospitals, health, crime has risen. and the economy, our budget. We're cutting money from almost every agency across the board. Besides for NYPD and FDNY, as announced yesterday, Department of Education, the sanitation, health and hospitals, libraries, the Department of Corrections, and there's still a hiring freeze across the board in all agencies. And of course, it's impacting our schools, our hospitals. We've seen over 30,000 provided service to over 30,000 migrants.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Blair, you also have real-world experience about what's going on in the border security. Would you address, well, I'm out of time, but just, we have a lot more questions and appreciate you all being here. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my opening statement, not only is border policy beyond our committee's legislative jurisdiction, but it's also far afield from the bipartisan approach that our committee has historically taken towards hard issues. I think we can all agree that we need to reform our immigration system. We need to better equip federal and state agencies with tools to deal with immigrants arriving at the southern border. But there's also a bipartisan agreement that the nation faces a deadly drug overdose crisis. Just last month, the House acted to reauthorize the Support Act on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis to provide vital resources to families struggling with addiction. The fact that we can agree on the urgency of these problems would suggest that we could come together to fix them. But that's not what we're doing here. Instead, the Republican majority continues to push a narrative of blame that deflects from their responsibility to effectively govern. And I would suggest that today's hearing is taking us further away from constructively addressing these problems. But it's an election year, so we're having an immigration hearing here in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Let me go to Mr. Norasta. Your organization has done extensive research on the baseless link between fentanyl and illegal boarding crossings. Based on this research, do you think that shutting down our southern border would really, as Republicans are claiming, solve the fentanyl crisis?
There's no evidence for that. The increase in drug overdose deaths is ultimately not a border security issue. Over 86% of convicted fentanyl drug traffickers were U.S. citizens in 2021. Over 90% of fentanyl seizures near or along the border were at legal crossing points or interior vehicle checkpoints. And just 0.02% of migrants arrested by Border Patrol for crossing illegally possessed any fentanyl whatsoever.
Well, thank you for clearing up this, what I consider baseless and unproductive talking point about this link between fentanyl and illegal boarding crossings. Let me ask the second question. Energy and Commerce's primary legislative responsibility, in my opinion, is to pass policies that will grow the economy. And the economy needs immigrants to grow. But Republicans, instead of joining us to achieve an expanded legal immigration process, keep proposing proposing what I call a harsh and inhumane approach to the border. So, Mr. Norasta, what are the types of restrictive immigration policies that Republicans are proposing, and why are they so damaging to our efforts to grow the economy?
So the last major piece of legislation introduced in Congress that was a Trump-led plan, the RAISE Act, in 2017 would have cut legal immigration in half. That was the last major legislative proposal that was endorsed by the former Republican president. That would be insanely counterproductive. The United States population is already growing at the slowest rate in history. The CBO projects that in about 20 years, 100% of U.S. population growth will come from immigration entirely. What we know from experience and from our understanding of economic theory is that countries with shrinking or stagnant populations have a lot harder time growing economically. It seems obvious to say, but people are good for the economy, and it would be great if we had more of them.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, the emphasis should be on effectively reforming the legal immigration process. But we need to come together, both Democrats and Republicans, and seriously address the challenges of this country. And I don't think having this partisan hearing today is helpful in that respect. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the Chair of the Health Subcommittee for
Thank you.
his 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the recognition, and thank you all for being here today. And we've heard that what President Biden has asked for from the very beginning of his administration about more money for the border. We also know on day one, and he brags about day one, with the stroke of a pen, he stopped the Remain in Mexico policy and other things that did open the flow of people coming across our southern border. And we do want to work together. There's negotiations going in the Senate. I know that we're going to have our position here in the House and work together to move forward. But you have to believe that the executive branch or the person in the White House wants to solve the problem, making an effort to solve the problem. And he could easily, we could say everything that he's proposed that Congress hasn't done, but he certainly hasn't undone the policies that he alone put in place at the very beginning, which is concerning. And we hear about the harsh and inhumane treatment of the border. When we were down there, I was with Dr. Burgess, and the stories of the migrants coming, their tours and their travels and the things that they go through, particularly the younger women, but all of them is harsh and inhumane. And if you are for massive amounts of immigration moving forward, the fact that what's happening at the border is harsh and inhumane from the travel that these people who are going through to move forward. And Mr. Blair, I know in this committee we have oversight of fentanyl. We talked about the Support Act, my friend brought up moving forward that I'm the primary sponsor for, and I don't think we can de-link what's happening in the border and fentanyl. I think it's absolutely related. Some people will say that, well, there was 26,000 pounds of illicit fentanyl in 2023, 89% increase from 2022. Some people will say, well, that just shows that we're catching a lot of it. But the question is, Mr. Blair, is your experience or we're catching not a higher percentage, there's just that much more coming across the border in the last year?
Unfortunately, of course, the fentanyl increases, the apprehension of fentanyl is increasing. However, between the ports of entry, due to our lack of good technology in order to understand the situation at the border, we don't know what is coming across between the ports of entry. We have no idea who.
Well, let me just, I want you to emphasize this because that's the point. So 90% of all fentanyl seized is the port of entry. So you'll hear people use that comment and say, well, we're stopping 90% of it's coming through the port of entry. That may not be accurate. And I want to answer that. 90% of it seized is at the port of entry. But that doesn't mean all of the fentanyl, that's 90% of the fentanyl coming to the country. Matter of fact, there's probably far more not coming through the port of entry because it's easier to get it across because we're not inspecting. That's the problem. That's what I want you to talk about.
Yes, sir, 100%. So based off of intel reports, when you're a Border Patrol agent, you receive intelligence reports from sector intelligence units. They have informants down in Mexico dictating where a lot of times where the narcotics are in the plazas. But unfortunately, when they come across the border, the massive amounts of illegal immigrants that are swarming across the border are used as a diversion for the Mexican cartels to send either narcotics or special interest aliens or those that they want to get away from us and not be apprehended. And unfortunately, the current technology that we have, whether that's ground-based sensors, hunting cameras, or known as drawbridge cameras, RVSS towers, or towers that I mentioned in my testimony, there's massive gaps. And so we have no idea what is actually happening between the ports.
What a border agent said to us when we were there, we were just on the New Mexico side of the El Paso border where we were there. He actually held up a water bottle. He said you could put, when cocaine comes across the ports of entry, you hide it. You've seen pictures that we've seen where they're hidden in fenders of cars and things such as that. But you could put enough fentanyl to kill a city in a water bottle and put it in a migrant's pocket, and they come across the border that way. And that's what they said they're finding. I mean, we can't, unless the border agent wasn't being honest with me. Is that what you were finding when you were there?
No, 100%. So we saw that in our drawbridge activations, the camera activations. We would get a large group of illegal aliens. We'd start apprehending them, since that is our current administration's prosecutorial discretion is to prioritize processing them, which leaves the rest of the border open. So when we're doing that, we'd see the drawbridge images of people with backpacks and everything else. The only reason we know that that is happening is because we've apprehended some of them, and they would eventually tell us exactly their tactics and techniques of coming forward. Specifically, like in Roma, when the Chinese were coming up, the cartel was making them throw away their passports. So it would make it so that we would have to take a lot longer to process them or intake these the Chinese illegal aliens. At that same time, upriver, that's when they would start sending up the narcotics in the upper Frontone area.
Okay, thank you. Well, I only have 5 seconds. Mr. Rector, I was asking you about the California Medicaid program, but, and undocumented workers, but my time has expired and I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Tonko of New York for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Congress needs to work together on an evidence-based approach to mental health, security, treatment, and recovery programs to protect our Americans struggling with addiction. Unfortunately, this Congress, we continue to see Republicans dodge that hard work of securing care for Americans who are suffering. Instead, they are baselessly fear-mongering about the relationship between immigration and fentanyl to score political points. Study after study has debunked the relationship between immigration and fentanyl that Republicans have been trying to sell the American people to whitewash their cruel and inhumane approach to the border. Look, here are the facts. We have an addiction crisis in our country. I ask for unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, to introduce into the record a 2020 study titled Socioeconomic Risk Factors for Fatal Opioid Doses in the United States.
And it'll be taken under advisement until we take them all up at the end of the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The study found that 99.6% of opioid overdose deaths from 2009 to 2015 were among U.S. citizens. If we are serious about disrupting the market for illicit drugs, we need to disrupt the demand for illicit fentanyl at its source by providing evidence-based treatment for people struggling with addiction in our country rather than trying to incarcerate and deport our way out of the problem. Here's another fact. Though Republicans claim that shutting down the border is the answer to illicit fentanyl trafficking, we found that shutting down the border exacerbates rather than mitigates the problem of fentanyl trafficking. I'd like also to introduce for the record, Mr. Chair, research by the Cato Institute titled Fentanyl is Smuggled for U.S. Citizens by U.S. Citizens, Not Asylum Seekers, which analyzes a data set from the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol on drug seizure statistics.
Likewise, it'll be taken under advisement. We'll take a look at it, but would expect that to come up at the end. And generally in this, so folks back home will know, generally in this sub, we don't, we just let everybody put their stuff in unless there's something particularly troublesome.
Well, thank you. This data shows that during COVID-19 related travel restrictions, fentanyl seizures at ports quadrupled, increasing from 1/3 of combined heroin and fentanyl seizures to over 90%. Finally, we can't keep ignoring the evidence about how fentanyl comes into the United States and who is bringing it in. At most, just 0.0009% of the people arrested by Border Patrol for crossing illegally possessed any fentanyl whatsoever. But in contrast, 90% of fentanyl seizures from October 20 of 2022 to August of 2023 happened at ports of entry. I will again ask for this, I know the process will review them at the end, but I'll include this third request, the following October 2023 analysis for the record titled Charting Drug Seizures at the U.S.-Mexico Border.
And likewise, Mr. Tonko, since we've had a couple colloquies on that, we'll give you an extra 15 or 20 seconds to, so when you see the clock run out, you got another 15 or 20.
Thank you. Documenting fentanyl seizures at the border using CBP data. This shows that an overwhelming majority of illicit fentanyl, nearly 90%, interdicted by Border Patrol happens at ports of entry. Now, Mr. Norashta, Republicans have rejected this analysis and baselessly claim that fentanyl is coming in primarily from immigrants who escape Border Patrol and not ports of entry. So my question is, what does the data actually tell us about the number of people crossing the southern border who are smuggling fentanyl?
So the data suggests that it's a very small percentage of illegal immigrants who are crossing the border or the ones who are smuggling fentanyl themselves. Of course, it is a black market. We don't know what we can't surveil, what's going on, because it's illegal, which is great evidence and argument, by the way, for expanding legal immigration, because the government can't regulate a black market. It can only regulate a legal market. But if the data we have are suggestive of that, it's far smaller than 1%.
All right, thank you. And what does this data suggest about whether completely shutting down the border can significantly reduce the amount of fentanyl coming into the United States?
Well, as we saw earlier when there were border shutdowns during the COVID emergency, when President Trump was in office, what we saw was a vast increase in the amount of fentanyl being smuggled through ports of entry into the United States. I mean, one of the devastating facts of folks dying from fentanyl in the United States is that it doesn't take very much. The quantity is very, very small, both to get high but also to overdose. And it is going to be very, I would say impossible for the government to enforce its way out of this problem by trying to interdict supply.
Well, thank you very much. I hope the fear-mongering stops and we come to the table to really get serious about resolving some of these crises and offering hope to people and benefit to our nation. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Duncan, Chair of the Energy Subcommittee, for his 5 minutes of questioning, and will publicly state my regret at your decision not to seek re-election this year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norasta, if I said that right, what's Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution say?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you for a second.
What does Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution say?
Is that the invasion section?
Yes, sir. It says that every state that joins the Union will be protected against invasion, period. What we're seeing across the southern border is an invasion. Look up the Westward Dictionary or any other dictionary, and you'll see that we have a large movement of people from one area to another constitutes an invasion. That's what we're seeing.
I'm
not asking you any questions. I only have a certain amount of time. Mr. Chairman, I have a suite of legislation I brought forward last January to address our border and national security mess. In light of this hearing, I want to focus on some of these this afternoon. The first is H.R. 776, the Build the Wall Act, which would direct 50% of assets seized from Mexican trafficking cartels toward building the southern border wall. These cartels have been trafficking in day laborers, children, sex workers, deadly Chinese fentanyl, and other narcotics, illegal cigarettes. These are huge moneymakers for the cartel. No wonder they're working against us securing the border. And it's time we crack down hard on their financing and then use that crackdown fund to generate greater security for our southern border. I'm proud to be the lead House sponsor of this legislation, along with Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who named his version the El Chapo Act as a nod toward which cartel he is specifically concerned about. Mr. Blair, I want to thank you for the excellent written testimony you provided today on the Mexican cartels and how they operate. The second is the Terrorist Deportation Act, H.R. 778. This bill would make automatic deportation proceedings of any non-citizen in the terrorist screening database from which we derive the no-fly list. That's why the bill's nickname has been the No-Fly Bye-Bye Bill. Mr. Chairman, CBP confirms that 294 illegal aliens on the terror watch list have been apprehended at the southwest border in fiscal year 2023, out of 35,433 illegal aliens apprehended at the border with criminal connections. But those are only the ones we caught. We have no idea how many people are in our country, how many terrorists are coming across that are gotaways, never had any touch with law enforcement. They just are in the country. The numbers that you hear that are reported by the government or by the media are apprehension rates, the people we had contact with law enforcement in some way. What about the ones that just came across the border, and we know that they come across the border without any contact with law enforcement? Thirdly, I want to discuss H.R. 779, the no Social Security for illegal aliens. Mr. Rector, in your testimony, you go into depth into the fiscal cost of illegal immigration, especially the strain illegal immigrants put on the social safety net, the magnet that government welfare programs provide for illegal immigration into the United States. Not only the strain on the federal government, but also the state services like schools and health care at the state level. So thank you for that. My bill addresses those two magnets. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the recent regrettable Twitter remarks from a member of this committee talking about her need for more illegal immigrants in her district to boost her redistricting efforts. She said the quiet part out loud, Democrats want more illegal immigrants in their districts to help them win elections. That's wrong. I'm proud to have sponsored H.R. 149, protecting our democracy by preventing foreign citizens from voting, which would deny federal funds to any jurisdiction that allows non-citizens to vote in their elections. I'm glad that Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is sponsoring the Senate companion bill. I've also co-sponsored numerous bills with my Republican counterparts to ensure that schemes like those from Ms. Clark are foiled by ensuring that only citizens be counted in the census for purposes of making district proportional. I ask my colleagues to join my effort on these efforts of important pieces of legislation, as well as H.R. 777, the Visa Overstay Enforcement Act, H.R. 780, the Mobilizing Against Sanctuary Cities Act. At the end of the day, the American citizens know that open border policies don't work. I don't disagree we ought to address an expansion of legal immigration. I worked with President Trump and House Republicans back when we had Goodlet 1 and Goodlet 2, and actually a third bill that was being worked on under Paul Ryan's speakership with all the leadership and every group within the Republican conference to actually address the issues of expanding legal categories, legal immigration categories to allow more folks to come in legally. But we're talking about illegal immigration. It is illegal to cross our border. It's against federal law to come across into our country without a visa, without a permission slip to come into this country. And that's what's happening. By the millions now under this administration have entered our country, and they've been released into this country. Every state's a border state now because you have illegal immigrants not just walking across the southern border into Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, but they're actually being transported into states all over the country. And that's wrong, and the American people know it's wrong. This is the biggest issue we need to face. It's time for Congress and the Biden administration to get serious about our southern border. The lack of seriousness from this administration and the failure to execute the laws and the Constitution I mentioned earlier are why I support and have co-sponsored articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden for failing our country and their constitutional duties to protect every state against invasion. And while I look forward to the return of President Donald Trump, who will once again help make America safe and secure by securing our southern border. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back and now recognize Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois for her 5 minutes. If you're ready, if not, we'll give you a minute and we'll move to somebody else. Ms. Schakowsky, you're recognized.
Okay. Whoops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me get myself together here a little. So before I ask a question, I wanted to ask the let's see, the Councilwoman Vernikov, is it, let me get it, let me try and get it.
Ms. Vernikov.
Vernikov. So I have Ukrainian blood running through my body too. My family, my mother's family was from Ukraine, Jewish family. But I have to tell you that I was disturbed by the implication that somehow you found in your testimony that the migrants could somehow be guilty of being somehow promoting anti-Semitism. And I think that is wrong, and that is what I took from what you said. And that is not a question, but I just want to tell you that's how it felt to me, that you were saying that anti-Semitism was being promoted by them. So I did have a question, however, again from, I'm bad with names, now.
Narasta.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Sorry, it's poorly spelled last name.
Okay, I'm sorry. So what I wanted to ask you, the question I wanted to ask you was that what does the data say when it comes to that if there is any real evidence that terrorists and terrorism is coming from south of the border?
So from 1975 through 2022, in terms of foreign-born terrorists who have entered as illegal immigrants, they have murdered a grand total of 0 Americans and 0 people on U.S. soil in attacks, and injured 0 people and successfully carried out 0 attacks.
So I think that's really, really important for us to look at. Hold on a second. What's the other question? Okay. One of the things that's been happening, and let me look at the time, I'm running out of time. In the city of Chicago, we had a roundtable talking about what are some of the efforts that we could do to actually help the migrants and to help us all. And one of them was about work permits. In the city of Chicago, we've actually been successful in speeding along some of the work permits. But I am just wondering what you think as a strategy, because we met with employers who said they are hungry for workers, and then employees, migrants, to a person who said, when I said, what do you want from the United States of America? They said, a job. We want to work. We want to take care of our own families. So the idea of really focusing on work permits, can you comment on that?
So I could not agree more with what you just said. I believe that if you were lawfully present in the United States on parole status or waiting for your asylum hearing or otherwise present, your employment authorization document, which allows you to work, should just be incident to your status. It should be attached to your status. You shouldn't have to go and fill out additional paperwork and ask more people and other government agencies for permission. It should be there from day one that you were here. Furthermore, as a libertarian, I do think that you should not have to ask, if you're lawfully present in the United States, have to ask people for permission to work in the United States. That should be something that we want people to do from day one. The government should not make it harder for these migrants who are here in the United States to work lawfully.
That's what they want to do. That's what employers want. This would be good for our economy, and it would be, I think, a good solution for the problem that we have. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
I'd just like to point out that I was one of the ones down at the border a couple of weeks ago. And what we're being told is that there's somewhere in the range of 1.7 million known gotaways. We don't know how many have come into the country that we couldn't interdict. I also found out that the cartels charge more for people who don't want to be interdicted by Border Patrol than those who just simply wade across the river and then turn themselves in. I can understand that those who are willing to turn themselves in, that they're here looking for a job or seeking asylum. What possible motive could those who don't want to be interdicted by the Border Patrol have for getting into the country? Could it possibly be drug trafficking? Could it possibly be sex slavery, sex trafficking? Could they be working for the cartel and other? And then Councilwoman Vernikov, my colleague from Illinois, made this comment about that you may have implied something in terms of anti-Semitism. I think what you were talking about was the very point I'm trying to make right now, that there are people crossing our border, we have no idea what their intentions are. And I don't know if you were in the country on 9/11, as Mr. Rector was here in Washington and Mr. Blair was here. I was in Alabama. It only took 19 to carry out that attack. And we know today that over 300 people have been interdicted, have been arrested, who are on the list of known suspected terrorists. Do you want to respond to that?
I'd love for the Congresswoman to be here when I respond, but first of all, I'd just like to respond that I've never said that migrants somehow cause anti-Semitism. All I said was simply that a Department of Homeland Security issued a memo warning that Hamas, jihadists, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah may come through because of the process that is virtually a non-process. We don't vet the people who come through the border properly.
Yeah, I
So
just wanted to give you a chance to get it on the record because I've been in classified briefings. I was in a classified briefing right before Christmas about some of the threats that we face in this country. And I think this is a serious, serious issue. And to imply that everybody's coming across the border is trying to get a job or to seek amnesty, or that's just not going to fly. And this idea that 90% of, the implication is that 90% of the fentanyl has been interdicted at our points of entry. That would imply that the cartels are unbelievably stupid. They know they're crossing our border at other places to bring their drugs in. We had almost 110,000 people die from drug overdose deaths in 2022. Over half of it is fentanyl. They're now mixing it with other drugs like Trank that Narcan won't work on. So I'm not sure that this is strictly a business proposition for them. It's at a point where I think maybe we've gone from a war on drugs to a war with drugs. And my colleague from South Carolina is talking about the state's ability to defend themselves. they're under attack. It's a drug attack that's taken the lives of tens of thousands of Americans, hundreds every day. I also want to ask something else, Mr. Rector. In your work on over the years, we talk about how low our unemployment rate is. That's a fake number. They changed how we calculate unemployment back in 2012, 2014, somewhere in there, and we stopped counting people who no longer look for a job. We've got the lowest labor participation rate in decades. So is this an issue that we're desperate for people to come in our country to work, or is it a problem that we got people who the government's paying not to work?
I think that we have an issue and have had an issue with the decline of labor force participation among low-skilled, particularly low-skilled males and low-skilled black males, going back decades now, and it clearly is related to them being driven out of the labor force by competition with largely illegal low-skilled labor. As I said, I wrote in my testimony, I have 89 studies that show that. Compared to,
So,
out of those 89.
I'm down to just a few seconds. So what you're saying is that we've created a competitive disadvantage for the citizen workforce.
That's right. And when you drive the males out of the workforce, then the marriage rate goes down, out of wedlock births go up, welfare goes up. It's a huge, huge negative cycle. And we shouldn't be doing it.
Madam Chair, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Dr. Ruiz for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Today I want to talk through each of the subjects brought up in the hearing and address some of the deeply misleading and disturbing fear-mongering that we've heard about immigrants and the impact of immigration on crime, public benefits, and economic growth. First and foremost, as an emergency physician, I have seen time and time again the devastating and often fatal effects of drug overdose. Fentanyl in particular continues to wreak havoc on our communities, and we have and we should still continue to address this crisis in our country. You know, when it's misinformation, it's not intentional. When it's disinformation, despite the facts, it's intentional, and there's a fine line between disinformation and straight out lying. So this is the disinformation that is being propagated, which is that drug cartels are using migrants to mule in fentanyl across the border. The fact is, while we are seeing a fentanyl crossing the southern border, immigration authorities say nearly all of that is smuggled by people who are legally authorized to cross the border, and the majority are by U.S. citizens. Virtually none is seized from migrants seeking asylum. So let me say that again, virtually none is seized from migrants seeking asylum. In regards to healthcare workers, you know, we've heard the disinformation that immigrants are putting an intolerable high strain on our healthcare system. A fact is immigrants are actually crucial to bolstering our healthcare workforce. In reality, Mr. Norosta, in a 2020 paper, you found that nearly 30% of all surgeons and physicians in the U.S. are immigrants, which is about 72% greater than their 16% share of the population. So, Mr. Norosta, what does this say about immigrants' positive impact on our healthcare system?
I think it says quite a lot. It shows that immigrants both increase the demand for healthcare services in the United States because there are people who are here who consume medical care. It also shows that they increase the supply of healthcare that is created in the United States and available to everyone. And I think one of the things we know from our study of economics is that people are good for the economy. In terms of the other aspects of the healthcare sector, immigrants are overrepresented in researchers for vaccines and medical technology and other types of innovations that have saved millions of lives in the United States. So across the board, in terms of expanding the supply of healthcare, immigrants have been an important component of that.
And in that same paper, you also found that 207,076 healthcare workers in the United States in 2020 during the pandemic were undocumented. You also wrote that unnecessary restrictions on undocumented immigrants entering the healthcare workforce may very well have attributed to the medical worker shortage we saw during the pandemic. Mr. Norista, how would providing opportunities for undocumented immigrants to regularize their status further strengthen our healthcare system, including our medical workforce?
Well, one of the main reasons is removing a lot by being lawfully present. That would reduce the burden of many of the other medical licenses that different medical professionals have to get for various occupations. Different states have different requirements, so this is not like by any means a uniform statement. But many states do restrict licenses to people who are either citizens or lawfully present. So by removing that basically burden by legalizing folks who are unauthorized immigrants, it will allow more of them to go into licensed occupations where there are those restrictions.
Thank you. And the last, disinformation. We have heard repeatedly false claims that undocumented immigrants are straining our public benefit system. The fact undocumented immigrants put more into our public resources than they take from them. For example, undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $11.7 billion in state and local taxes every year, but are also ineligible for a large swath of government services like Social Security and Medicare. So, are immigrants really straining our public benefit system, and what's the real impact?
So immigrants in total are not straining the public services or the increasing net fiscal costs in the United States. Studies that rely on dynamic economic models or generational accounting models generally find that immigrants in the United States have a positive net fiscal contribution, and meaning that they pay more in taxes than they consume in benefits. And one of the major reasons why that is because most of them come after without having consumed public school for themselves. So they come in their 20s or 30s, they weren't put through public school. As a result, they start paying taxes immediately and start to contribute more. Whereas somebody like myself, who is a native-born American and went to school in California, into public school, incurred somewhere around $200,000 of costs by the time I was 18. If I had immigrated from abroad at that age, I wouldn't have incurred that.
And you know, I'm going to yield back, but it's a shame we're wasting.
Gentleman
time
yields back.
Airing that partisan political showmanship grievances when we should be working
now,
together at the table.
I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hard to know where to start because there's so many good places to counter-argue. First, I want to address just the common refrain from my colleagues in the Democrat Party. It's always a story without end, right? It's always a story where we're about to tell you the plot line and a conclusion, but we never actually get there. And they're always talking about working together and comprehensive immigration reform. These are meaningless terms, completely meaningless. If they ever put pen to paper, it's usually something about mass amnesty or just something so far out there that it's not comprehensive at all. It's not working together at all. So let's just dismiss this idea that there's even a common goal. I would appreciate an honest debate about whether you want more illegal immigration or not, whether you want open borders or not. That's a policy position to take. Nobody ever wants to say it. They always say they want closed borders, they want secure borders. Of course we want secure borders, they say. But all of the actions dictate otherwise. So let's have an honest debate about whether we should have borders or not. At least that would be honest. Mr. Nawasteh, some of the points you make about the costs. You say it's so unlikely that anyone would ever be a victim of an illegal immigrant terrorist attack. What is your point there? How is that data relevant? If we all assume you're correct and that it's extremely unlikely that any American is going to be threatened by an illegal immigrant, what's your point exactly?
Well, I have several points in that. One is to put out evidence and research because the statement gets made by lots of people on both sides about how dangerous terrorism is along the border, and it's important to have facts out there about that. Secondly, the federal government has limited resources, thankfully. It has limited resources, and so it must choose where to allocate its limited security resources most efficiently to protect the lives of
All right, but you agree, there's more to policy than numbers, right? I mean, there's preferences, there's values, there's, if we're talking about the border, the reason I want an honest debate on that is because I want an honest debate on whether there is value in sovereignty, whether there is value in our ability to absorb mass immigration, whether there's value in following the rule of law, even if you disagree with it. Then we'd have an honest debate. And also, you know, speaking of dangers here, I'm just going to read you Texas DPS data. This is between, over the last, basically over a decade, 300,000 illegal aliens were charged with more than 500,000 criminal offenses, arrests for almost 1,000 homicide charges, 64,000 assault charges. It's not nothing, right? It's very unlikely that I'm going to be in a car accident. It doesn't mean I don't wear a seatbelt. So when I ask like what the point of the data is, I mean, I mean that in all honesty. I don't understand the point. I think one of your points might also be that most of the people coming across the border are looking for a job, right?
Yes.
And I know you're not making this point, but my colleagues often do, which is, if that's the case, then why aren't we talking about reforms to asylum, the asylum process? Why aren't we talking about reforms to the asylum process? We know just from the data that the vast majority of people coming from Central American countries are coming here for work. They're coming here as economic migrants. They don't have an asylum case. We all know it, and yet that's what's claimed. You look at countries that have, you know, brutal dictatorships, Iran, Russia, China, they have much higher rates of asylum acceptance. So why aren't we talking about asylum reform? Why aren't we talking about following the processes that we have in place to keep us safe, to keep our rule of law intact? I mean, Mr. Namaste, you know, you make another argument about economic benefits. Like basically, if there's job openings, then we have to just accept immigration in order to fill those job openings. What is the upper limit there? Is there a limiting principle to that?
I think the limiting principle is the desire of the free market and how much we want the U.S. economy to grow.
So would unemployment rates be the limiting principle? Like if we have very high unemployment, would you stop legal immigration?
Well, the way that markets work, sir, is that it would stop on its own because there'd be no labor demand for it. So if there's no jobs, I mean, these people come because Americans want to employ them primarily. And if there's nobody here who wants to hire them in the United States, then they're not going to come, in the same way that it determines like the flow of American citizens between states, between cities, is a lot of times due to the differences.
I mean, I'm sure you agree with though. It's very much in line with single variable analysis. You know, it's like if it saves one life, let's lock down the country. And if it saves one life from COVID deaths, it's the same. It's the same line of thinking. It's single variable analysis. It's numbers.
The same at all.
It's numbers only, and policy isn't made just by numbers. That's why I don't associate with libertarianism, because libertarianism
You don't like numbers?
is no, but no, I like values as well. I like holistic policy making with values and preferences and limiting principles. And the unfortunate reality is with immigration, there's no limiting principles on the other side. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Peters of California for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Norris, I'll just give you a quick 15 seconds to respond to that if you wanted.
When we have security threats to the United States and the U.S. government has scarce resources, knowing how to allocate those resources efficiently to save American lives, I think, is important. We can talk about words and meanings and things like values and sovereignty, and all those things do matter. Individual liberty also matters. Free market economics also matters. But if we are so hung up on words like sovereignty, instead of figuring out how to allocate scarce resources to save lives, frankly, I'm more interested in saving lives than whatever magic buzzwords people want to use.
All right, great. Thank you. The 2003 fiscal year appropriations bill passed last Congress included increased resources for border security and personnel, and now there's talks in the Senate for a new border funding deal. And the House will evaluate whatever the Senate sends over. But I have to say it's a shame that even, you know, before we started this week, Speaker Johnson was on Twitter saying that he has no interest in working with us on a bipartisan solution to get serious about what we need to create a just and humane solution to what's happening at the border, and an effective one, by the way. The Biden administration has asked for supplemental funding to add more personnel needed at the border to properly process immigrants and asylum seekers. And it is true that most people are denied asylum. I think it's 90%. But because we don't have the processing here, they have to wait a year or two to get that denial. If we had more people there, we could get them their denial that they're going to get ultimately and send them back right away. It would alleviate the backlogs in the system that are causing overcrowding in detention facilities and leaving migrants in a state of prolonged uncertainty, which isn't good for anybody. So these seems like immediate steps Congress can take to address challenges arising from an increase in border crossing, which no one denies. And unfortunately, some folks would rather have a conversation about shutting down the border than making the smart investments that we need in staff to process immigrants safely and humanely. Mr. Narasta, how can we make smarter, more effective investments in border personnel in a way that keeps our country safe and prevents chaos at the border?
So I think it's important to view this systemically. A lot of folks who are asking for asylum are absolutely do not have legitimate asylum claims. We can't really figure that out until they go through the process, but that's absolutely true. But the reason why they're going through that route is because there is not another visa or way available for them to come lawfully. So when you think about it systemically like this, by expanding H-2 visas for temporary guest workers, for instance, for lower and mid-skilled workers, you will divert a lot of these folks who are trying to go through the asylum system into these lawful pathways and then reduce the pressure on the overburdened border personnel, on Border Patrol, and a lot of these other folks who are running the asylum system. So you got to think about it systemically like that.
What's the relationship that you've seen between immigration and innovation? I see like over 35% of businesses have at least one immigrant founder. 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants and their children. What's the relationship that you see, and in more legal pathways, would it boost our ability for innovation and to lead the world in technological change?
Liberalized immigration would vastly increase productivity growth and the technological development in the United States. Immigrants to the United States are disproportionately likely to patent, disproportionately likely to start firms at every single firm size. So you're talking about small businesses, medium, large, and those companies that end up being unicorns, like those that dominate Silicon Valley. Immigrants are overrepresented at every stage of that. They have been throughout American history. It's currently not an aberration. And one of the other facts we know from Charles I. Jones, who is a professor at Stanford, who is an economist who studies economic growth, is one of the best predictors of the supply of scientists and innovators who are working in the United States. And immigrants are overly represented in all of these, both in the graduate school level as well as practicing scientists. So if we want to really expand the productive potential of the United States, push out that productive possibilities frontier, which I want, then we do need to expand legal immigration opportunities. The other way is by lower skilled immigrants, actually, by providing a lot of goods and services to other Americans through childcare, through food prep, for all the other very valuable goods and services supply. It allows higher skilled Americans, particularly women, to work longer hours, to even work in the first place in the labor force, and to fulfill their dreams and aspirations, which in turn, of course, expands the U.S. economy.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony, and thanks to all witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and let me make an announcement real quick. What we're going to try to do is get this in before votes. It's going to be tough. Recognize the regular members for of the subcommittee for their 5 minutes. All waive-ons will be 3 minutes from the full committee. That being said, I recognize the gentleman from North Dakota. Did I get it wrong again?
No, you got it right.
Got it right, okay.
South Dakota has Mount Rushmore, we have oil.
There you go, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We know that frequent deployments to the southern border are affecting staffing levels at the northern border. In North Dakota, several ports of entry close early, at 4 or 5 p.m., while their Canadian counterparts are open until 9 or 10 p.m. Families farm on both sides of the border. Businesses rely on customers from both sides of the border. Commerce doesn't just stop at 4 p.m. when CBP closes the port of entry. Ms. Diana Dixon from Northgate, North Dakota, would like to know what the justification for keeping our ports of entry closed is. Mrs. Dixon's bars, Donna's Den, closed because the business primarily drew Canadian customers who were no longer able to get back across the border at 4 p.m. Ms. Mary Holmquist, whose hometown is Niche, North Dakota, has contacted our office about how she can no longer have dinner celebrations with her Canadian relatives who live just across the border. That means no Christmas dinners, no birthday dinners with their family without spending the night, all because ports of entries are closed. Mr. Alan Ng from Sherwood, North Dakota, just 2 miles south of the Canadian border. He's been a mayor there for 36 years. He used to own a hardware store, and 1/3 of his customers were Canadian. He said that the small business town rely on Canadian customers and that the current hours are killing their economy. Mr. Ng equated keeping the northern border open for business to a small town possessing an ambulance and a fire truck. They only get used a few times a year, but you want them available when you need them, and it's the government's responsibility to maintain them. I've introduced bipartisan bicameral H.R. 4961 requiring U.S. Customs and Border Protection hours to operate at the northern borders to match or exceed pandemic hours. Do Do you know how frustrating it is for my constituents as far away from the southern border as possible to not be able to conduct legal commerce at a time when we have illegal commerce, illegal entry, resources being deployed down at the southern border? To be quite frank, it is absolutely mind-numbing, and I share their frustration, I share their concern. But in a different life, so my wife legally immigrated when we got married. 15 of my first 20 cases in federal court were illegal reentry cases. Vast majority of my office time in district is spent on H-2A, H-2B, H-1B. And recognizing that we need reforms to our legal immigration system and have needed them for a very long time is true. But I want to use the next 2.5 minutes, Mr. Blair. In a different life, you'd have been sitting at a desk like that. I'd have been at council's table. We might have been having a little more confrontational conversation in a cross-examination at some point in time. But I think one thing you and I could talk about maybe a little better, because I've seen some looks and from frustration. A lot of this stuff sounds really good in a hearing room. I don't think people really know how crime occurs. And I don't think we really talk about it. And I don't think we deal with it, particularly in a place where there's mass chaos and lack of operational capacity. If you are seeking asylum at the southern border, you're turning yourself into the authorities, particularly under this current administration's guidance regarding asylum. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So why in the heck would you carry fentanyl when you're turning yourself in for an asylum claim? Would that help or hurt your asylum claim?
That would hurt your asylum claim.
So people who are being legally apprehended, legal port of entry between ports of entry that are there specifically to turn themselves into to somebody with a U.S. uniform on, probably aren't carrying fentanyl.
No, sir.
So how is the fentanyl getting across the border?
By those who are trying to evade us.
Okay. So when 400 migrants get to a border, Eagle Pass, pick whichever one you want, what happens to our interdiction officers in that area?
All of us have to go to those that gave themselves up.
So you're helping process the people who are claiming asylum, coming in and turning themselves in?
Yes, sir.
Does the cartel know that?
Yes, sir.
What are they doing 20 miles away?
They are sending narcotics north. Special interest aliens.
And this is one of the things I've said. We often refer to the cartels as drug cartels. And there's a reason for that, because they do that. But they're not. They're in the business of money making. It could be anybody in a human trafficking situation. Whatever they can make money on, they're going to make money on. It doesn't have to be fentanyl.
Correct.
And when we get a handle on the fentanyl crisis, it'll be a different drug crisis. We shut down methamphetamine, clandestine methamphetamine labs, North Dakota, Minnesota. Our attorney generals worked with that. Guess who got into it right after it? Cartels. And we talk about legal citizens, ports of entry, who's bringing it across, who's not bringing it across, who's using it. We're dealing with all that. Who makes the fentanyl?
The cartels make the fentanyl with China precursors.
Like almost all of it.
Almost all of it.
So the fentanyl that somebody's overdosing on in Grand Forks, North Dakota is made by who?
The Mexican cartels.
And it's made where?
In Mexico.
And it's getting across the border.
Correct.
And our lack of operational security at the southern border is helping effectuate that, whether you're in New York, Grand Forks, Minnesota, Chicago, anywhere.
Yes, sir.
So I don't particularly care if it's a U.S. citizen going across, picking it up from the cartels and bringing it across and poisoning teenagers in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Lesko, the vice chair of this subcommittee, and thank her for chairing for me a few minutes ago for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for coming here and testifying today. Earlier today, my colleague, Ms. DeGette, said today, and then Biden said recently that border security could be solved if only Congress acted, if only Republicans would work with the Democrats. Well, I would like to remind my friend and colleague that Democrats had total control of the presidency, the Senate, and the House for 2 years and did absolutely nothing to secure the border or any immigration issue. And in fact, I think there wouldn't even be a hearing today if they still had control of the House. The only reason we're having a hearing on border security is because Republicans have a majority in the House, and we care about it because we actually believe that it is a national security crisis and a humanitarian crisis, and we want to try to solve it. So it is not just, as Ms. Castor and Mr. Pallone said, a political issue, an election year issue. This is a real issue. And it is a national security issue. It is a humanitarian crisis for the illegal immigrants themselves. Women are getting raped. They're being sold, kids are being sold into sex slavery. This is a fact. In December of 2023, 302,000 border crossings occurred. That's greater than any time in history. That's greater than the entire population of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in just 1 month. You compare that to just 3 years ago under President Trump in December of 2020, 74,000 crossings. In fiscal year 23, 169 people were caught that we know of that are on the terrorist watch list. In Lukeville, Arizona, the port of entry was just recently closed because all of the people crossing in the Organ Pipe National Monument across the border, and they had to divert the Border Patrol officers over there to control it. And many of them were military-aged men from Africa. This is a concern. So, Mr. Blair, on December 13th, an internal officer safety alert warned CBP agents to be vigilant after the Mexican military seized 10 IEDs near the Tucson, Arizona border sector. Does that concern you?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it concern you that there were 169 illegal immigrants that were caught that were on the terrorist watch list in fiscal year 23?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it concern you that there are thousands of illegal migrants that are coming from countries of interest where people from those countries may want to harm Americans?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Rector, on Saturday, while speaking to reporters on the White House South Lawn, President Biden once again said he doesn't think the situation at the southern border is a crisis. Why do you think President Biden says this? Why do you think he wants open border policies? Do you have any idea?
Well, his policy is to pretend this isn't happening because he doesn't have any answer, because he's generated this problem by basically telling people all across the world that if they come to the southern border, they will be let in and they will be granted residency, and eventually they'll be given U.S. citizenship. He's going to give them access to the welfare system. We talk about amnesty and welfare, but his policies, for example, in Build Back Better, created massive new welfare programs for illegal immigrants. You know, he's saying, come on in. We're going to let you in, and we're going to give you free stuff, and we're going to give you citizenship when you get here. And the American public doesn't agree with that, so he has to pretend it's not really happening.
You know, and the gentleman from the Cato Institute said something to the effect of, oh, well, we need to increase legal migration because it worked. It worked. You know, there was less people coming from those countries when Biden had paroled in the people from the countries, if I'm not correct. But didn't that attract other people from other countries? Because we had 302,000 people coming from all over the world, I think 160 countries. Mr. Rector, what do you think?
Absolutely. The solution by libertarians to illegal immigration is to allow unlimited legal inflows. Everyone can come. And when you do that, when you even talk about doing that, what you generate is more and more people willing to come. And that basically changes the nature of the United States. It alters our sovereignty. But in particular with the current illegals, they're very low skill. They absorb huge amounts of government benefits, contrary to what people suggest. They do pay some taxes, but it's a huge burden on the U.S. taxpayer. And having more of it, legal or illegal, isn't going to be the solution.
And the gentlelady yields back. I appreciate the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't even really know where to start because I've heard so many comments in here that really deserve to be questioned, refuted, and addressed. So one thing that really stuck out to me, and I really apologize, your last name is very hard to pronounce. How do you pronounce your last name?
Narasta.
Narasta?
Yeah.
Okay, definitely not how it is spelled.
It's very poorly spelled. I apologize for that. It's an Ellis Island problem.
Narasta.
Narasta.
Narasta. Okay, so earlier you had said that there is no financial impact to the communities that are absorbing these illegal immigrants.
No, so I talked about nationwide, federal, state, and local, the net fiscal impact is positive, but I did highlight in some places like New York City that have very bad local policies like right to shelter, that there is a negative fiscal impact. And you see it in states that rely on like a state income tax. They have a negative fiscal impact on average, but states that don't have a state income tax, like Texas, like Florida, for instance, states, I approve of that policy tremendously, by the way, not having a state income tax.
Taxation is theft, so, you know.
And so those states tend to do a little bit better because the forms of taxes that they have, like
Right.
property and are spread.
But I think we can all agree that there is a cost to the illegal invasion that we are experiencing. For example, in the last year, $60 billion, which as a point of reference, $60 billion is what we are arguing over right now as top-line numbers for funding the federal government, of which in 3 days we could have a potential shutdown over. $60 billion is what we spend that costs us taxpayers for hiring limited English proficiency teachers for these students that are in the country illegally. So that $60 billion, that is a nationwide impact, and that's just one out of many. I have records of veterans that have been kicked out of housing facilities to make room, the healthcare costs of the 700,000 illegals that will receive free healthcare in California. I mean, the list can go on and on and on and on of the freebies. And in fact, if you are on social media and you check out any one of the Facebook pages that is Cruzando la Frontera, you can find where they are actually giving a blueprint of how much you get when you are finally processed. And I don't like the term paroled into the United States. I know that's a Biden thing now. It's catch and release, you know, because no one shows up for their hearing in 7 years. They actually are receiving benefits at the taxpayer's dime. So I just think it's important that we dispute that. And of course, in New York, we've seen where the NYPD took $1 billion cut as a result of the illegal immigration. And as the wife of a first responder, we should be actually reinforcing our first responders with additional resources rather than cutting them. But I want to direct and take on a completely different topic that we haven't talked about yet today, which is agriculture. And of course, we have seen how there have been countless shipments of produce that have been caught at the legal ports of entry. I have actually been in the back of a semi-truck that was filled with tomatoes bound for my home state of Florida, and it was found to have marijuana and methamphetamine in the truck. That is a 10% issue, right? So that is 10% of the trucks that are carrying illegal narcotics are actually apprehended, caught. So that's a problem. But when you look at the macro of it, one thing that we need to consider is the cost to domestic production of our agricultural products as a result of cartel-subsidized activities. When you think about avocados, lemons, limes, basically the entire agricultural sector in Mexico is subsidized by the cartels. The impact that can have on our domestic production, it's one, an unfair competitive advantage. I would like everybody on this panel to just give some quick commentary, because I now am down to the wire on this, but this has a massive, massive national security implication, because food security is national security, and disastrous trade policies, along with this now cartel-subsidized pressure that we are facing, particularly in states like mine in Florida, they have real-world implications. So I'll start going down the line, if you can just touch on that very briefly.
Well, the simplest fact is that low-skill immigrants get a whole lot more in benefits than they pay in taxes, and high-skill immigrants pay more in taxes than they get in benefits. They're no different than general population, but the reality is that as illegals come in, 40 to 50% of them don't have a high school degree. And over the course of a lifetime, they are going to absorb huge amounts of benefits, and they're not going to pay very much in taxes. We can do that for U.S.-born people. We cannot do that for 10 million illegals coming across the
And
border.
if I could get
That's
each
what
of the
we got.
witnesses to shorten their answer very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, yeah.
Mexican cartels subsidize the agriculture out of Mexico.
And it's a problem for our domestic production,
All
yes.
right. Next.
Oh,
could just quickly comment on the economic impact in New York, which is $10.6 billion that we're about to spend on the migrant crisis. And we're actually spending $1.7 million every month on keeping Floyd Bennett open. So just to respond to those things.
Increasing H-2A visas is a great way to improve the competitive stature of American agriculture, which would expand immigration and reduce border chaos. So you get a 3-for-1.
Except for
All right.
H2A
And
is
the
seasonal and we
gentle-
are year-round in
gentle
Florida.
lady-
So
You can
H2A doesn't
reform
work.
it too.
Gentlelady yields back.
I-
All right.
I reluctantly yield.
I understand. Here's the dilemma that I have as the chair. I've got more people than are presently here that would like to ask questions. I'm out of time because we have to go to the floor and vote. So I'll ask the witnesses, can you all stick around for 20, 25 minutes, and then we will come back for about another half an hour? Is everybody okay with that? Somebody got a flight they have to catch? Speak now, forever hold your peace. All right, seeing that, I appreciate your patience with us. We will be back. At this point, we will recess the subcommittee until about 5 minutes after the last vote. How long after the first votes are called? 5 minutes after the last vote is called. All right, we stand in recess. Okay.